It's 30,000 years ago. You've just moved in with your partner's family, and her mother has been watching you eat for the last 20 minutes without blinking. You want a little space, so you look around. There's no door, there's no bedroom, there's no stepping out for some air. There's a fire, a shelter, maybe 15 relatives, and her. All day, every day, for the rest of your life. You can't block her number. She is the number. So how does anyone survive that? Here's the thing nobody tells you about the good old days. Privacy is a modern invention. For almost all of human history, you lived pressed right up against the exact people who drove you quietly insane. And that included the in-laws. No walls to disappear behind. No car to sit in with the engine off. No spare room, no second house, no group chat to complain to. And somehow your ancestors didn't just quietly strangle each other over it. They built whole systems to deal with it. Stranger systems than you would ever guess. So the real question isn't whether they had mother-in-law problems. Of course they did. Everyone did. The question is what they invented to survive them. Let's start with the obvious one. That joke you've heard 1,000 times, the nagging mother-in-law, the son-in-law rolling his eyes, feels cheap, feels modern, feels like something a tired comedian says at 11 at night to a half-empty room. It isn't modern at all. Anthropologists have gone looking for this tension all over the planet. Different continents, different languages, people who have never met, never traded, never shared a single story, and they keep finding the same thing. Friction between a person and their partner's mother shows up again and again and again. It's one of the most common social patterns humans have, which is a genuinely strange thing to be universal. You'd expect fear of snakes to be universal. You'd expect a taste for sweet food to be universal. But mild dread of your mother-in-law? That's not a coincidence. That's a clue. And once you see why, you can't unsee it. Okay, this is where it gets weird. Start with the physical reality, because it's brutal. You did not have a home the way you picture a home. You had a band. A cluster of people, often somewhere between 20 and 50, moving together, sleeping close, eating from the same fire. When someone joined a family through a partnership, they didn't drive off to a house across town and show up for the holidays. They folded into the group, permanently. Every single day, within arm's reach. Now think about what that actually means. There's no such thing as a private argument. There's no going home to cool off, because you are already home, and so is she. Every mood, every sigh, every pointed little look, it all lands in a space the size of a living room, shared by 3 generations of people who cannot leave and cannot pretend they didn't hear that. You know that feeling on a long flight, wedged next to a stranger, silently counting the minutes until you land? Imagine the flight never lands. That was daily life. There's no headphones, no window to stare out of, no drink cart to wait for. Just people, fire, and time. And into that pressure cooker, drop the one relationship humans seem hardwired to find difficult. It's honestly a wonder anyone made it to breakfast. And here's a detail that makes it even richer. In plenty of societies, you didn't just wind up living near her by accident. You had to earn your way in by working for her. Anthropologists call it bride service. A young man would move in with his partner's family and spend months, sometimes years, proving himself. Hunting, hauling, providing, doing the hard and dangerous jobs. And a good share of the meat he brought home went straight to his in-laws. To her. So really picture that. You can't avoid your mother-in-law. You can't out-argue your mother-in-law. And on top of all of it, you are basically her employee. You go out, you risk your neck chasing dinner across open country, and you come back and hand the best cut to the woman who's been watching you eat since sunrise. If you've ever felt like you had to prove yourself to your partner's parents, congratulations. That instinct is older than farming. So, what do you do when you can't add distance with space? You get creative. You add distance with rules. Here's the part nobody puts in the textbooks. In a lot of societies that anthropologists have studied closely, there are formal, spelled-out rules for how you deal with your mother-in-law. Not vibes, not gentle suggestions, actual social law, taken completely seriously. They're called avoidance relationships. Think of them as in-law avoidance rules. And they can be intense. In some communities, a man and his mother-in-law are simply not supposed to look directly at each other. In others, they aren't allowed to speak, not one word, ever, for their entire lives. Sometimes they can't sit in the same shelter. Sometimes they can't even say each other's names out loud. If something genuinely needs to be communicated, it gets relayed through a third person, usually the wife, standing in the middle like a very tired switchboard operator, passing messages back and forth between two people 3 feet apart. Now, your first instinct is probably to laugh, and honestly, fair. It sounds absurd. But flip it around for a second. What is a rule like that actually doing? It's manufacturing personal space in a world that has none. It's a social wall built out of pure custom, standing in for the physical wall nobody could build. You can't hand two clashing people separate rooms, so you hand them separate rules instead. Which is either deeply ridiculous or deeply clever. Probably both. And here's the detail that makes the whole thing click. Because the same societies that build these walls of silence also do the exact opposite, with different relatives. Anthropologists call it a joking relationship. With certain in-laws, often a brother-in-law or a particular cousin, you're not just allowed to be rude, you're expected to. You trade insults, crude jokes, teasing that would start a fight with anyone else. It's practically a duty. So sit with that contrast. One relative you cannot speak to at all. Another you're required to mock. That's not random. That's a society sorting its relationships on purpose, deciding which bonds need cooling down and which ones need loosening up, and building a custom for each. The tension gets a wall. The safe bond gets a running joke. Same goal, opposite tools. And underneath all of it is something deadly serious. A band this small couldn't afford a real feud. There was no moving out, no cutting people off, no starting fresh across town. If a family tore itself apart over in-law drama, that wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. Fewer hands to hunt, fewer eyes watching for predators in the dark. A group that splintered was a group that got weaker, right when weakness could get everyone killed. So these strange little rules weren't really about etiquette. They were about survival. Keeping the peace between two people who rubbed each other wrong was, quietly, a way of keeping the whole band alive. And it gets stranger still, because in some places, they didn't stop at silence. They invented a whole separate language. Stay with me, because this is the good part. Among some Aboriginal Australian communities, the Dirbal-speaking people are the classic example anthropologists point to. There's something linguists call avoidance speech. And it works like this. Most of the time, you talk normally, but the moment a forbidden relative comes near, a mother-in-law being the prime example, you switch. You stop using your everyday vocabulary and shift into an entirely different set of words. Not a different accent, not slightly politer phrasing. Different words. The grammar stays the same underneath, so it's clearly one language, but almost every ordinary word gets swapped for a special one, reserved for exactly these moments. There's the way you speak all day, every day. And then there's the way you speak the second she's within earshot. Sit with how much effort that is. A whole community collectively agreed to build, teach, and memorize a second vocabulary, carried around in everyone's head for a lifetime, purely to handle in-law relationships with the right kind of respectful distance. Children grew up learning both. That's not primitive. That's not clumsy people fumbling around in the dark. That is a stunningly sophisticated social tool, maintained across generations, for a problem you currently solve by sighing loudly and going to load the dishwasher. And that's the thing I want to be careful about here. It's easy to hear all this and picture something quaint or strange or backward. It's none of those. These are modern people, living now with rich and complicated cultures of their own, not fossils, not a magic window into some frozen past. What they show us isn't what our ancestors definitely did on some specific Tuesday. It's something bigger. It's proof of how seriously humans everywhere take this one exact relationship, serious enough to reshape how they speak. So let that sit for a second. All over the world, with no contact between them, humans keep independently deciding that the in-law bond needs special handling. Rules, silence, sometimes an entire language of its own. Which brings us to the obvious question. Why? Why this relationship specifically? Your annoying neighbor doesn't get a secret vocabulary. Your cousin doesn't get a lifelong wall of silence. What is it about a mother-in-law that makes humans everywhere reach for the rulebook? And here's where it stops being funny and starts being biology. Think about who is actually related to whom. A mother and her own daughter share a deep genetic stake in each other. Their blood. But a mother-in-law and a son-in-law, they share no genes at all. They're strangers, biologically speaking, suddenly bound together for life by one person they both love and a baby they'll both help raise. Now here's the tension. Both of them are invested in that grandchild. The grandmother and the young parent both desperately want the child to thrive. So far, so good. But their interests don't line up perfectly. A grandmother is related to all of her grandchildren equally, and she's got other children and their kids to worry about too. She's spreading her care thin across a whole family tree. The young parent is laser focused on this baby, right here, right now, above all others. Same goal, slightly different math. And some researchers think that small gap, that mismatch in who cares most about what, is exactly where the friction lives. Two people forced onto the same team, both loving the same child, but pulling on the rope from slightly different angles. And notice it's usually the same two roles at the center of it, an older woman and the younger person who married her child. That pairing shows up in the friction stories over and over, in culture after culture. Not because anyone's cruel. It's not that anyone's a villain. It's that evolution handed them goals that overlap almost perfectly. Almost. And almost is where 1,000 generations of quiet tension come from. And this isn't only a human thing. In some social animals, when unrelated females end up living and breeding in the same group, biologists see friction too. A bit of conflict over whose offspring get the attention. Same underlying logic. Shared roof, unshared genes. It turns out the in-law problem might be older than our species. I should say this plainly, though. This is one explanation, not a proven fact carved in stone. It's a way of making sense of a pattern, and it's still argued about. But it fits uncomfortably well, doesn't it? You've probably felt that exact dynamic at a family dinner and never once had a word for it. And then it gets better. Because there's a flip side to this whole story, and it quietly changes everything. Here's the part that surprises people. That same mother-in-law, the one you needed a rule book and a secret language to survive, may have been the single most valuable person in your child's entire life. Humans are strange among animals. In most species, a female reproduces right up until she dies. Humans don't. Women very often live for decades after they can no longer have children of their own. From a cold, ruthless evolutionary standpoint, that's bizarre. Why keep someone around who isn't producing more offspring? What are all those extra years actually for? And here's the wild part. Almost no other animal does this. A menopause like ours, followed by a long, healthy life afterward, is incredibly rare in nature. As far as we can tell, only a handful of other species do anything like it, and strangely, several of them are whales. In some killer whale pods, the old females stop breeding but keep leading. They remember where the food is in a bad year, and researchers have found that calves with a living grandmother in the pod survive better. Grandmothers, guiding the family through hard times. In the ocean. Let that sink in. Back to us. One leading answer for why human women live so long past childbearing is called the grandmother hypothesis. The grandmother theory, basically. And the idea is quietly beautiful. Those extra decades aren't wasted at all. A grandmother spends them keeping the next generation alive. She gathers food, she carries the baby, she watches the toddler while an exhausted mother finally gets to rest. Researchers studying living hunter-gatherer communities have found that hardworking grandmothers really do line up with better-fed, healthier grandchildren. And it wasn't only muscle and babysitting. She was memory. She had lived through the droughts, the bad winters, the years the usual food didn't come. She knew which plant would save you and which one would kill you, where the water hid when the streams ran dry, what your family did the last time things fell apart. In a world with no books and no maps, that knowledge lived in exactly one place. The oldest heads in the group. Lose her, and you lost the only backup copy. Because raising a human child was never a two-person job. A newborn is helpless for an absurdly long stretch of time, and a mother alone simply could not do it. So humans raise children as a group. Scientists call it cooperative breeding, but you already know the phrase for it. It takes a village. And the beating heart of that village, over and over and over, was a grandmother. So look at what she really was. Yes, she watched you eat without blinking. Yes, you couldn't escape her, couldn't win an argument with her, sometimes couldn't even speak to her directly. And also, She may be a huge part of the reason your child lived long enough to grow up at all. She was the problem and the solution, standing in the same shelter, wearing the same face. That is the deal our ancestors quietly lived with. Not a sitcom punchline. A person who could drive you to the edge of your patience and keep your whole family alive in the very same afternoon. And for hundreds of thousands of years, across every continent we've ever looked at, humans decided, reluctantly, carefully, sometimes in total silence, that she was worth keeping close. So the next time your mother-in-law has a comment about your cooking, try to remember what you're actually looking at. You're looking at one of the oldest, strangest, most important relationships our species ever built. We come from people who learned to live with her because they never could have made it without her. 300,000 years later, you're still doing it. Funny how that works. So tell me honestly, could you survive a lifetime with no door, no bedroom, and no way on earth to avoid your in-laws? Let me know in the comments.